inform policymaking for fire resilience. There are complicated natural and institutional dynamics at play as we work toward a more fire resilient Southern California. With this series, we're bringing together experts from across California to unpack those dynamics. I'm speaking to you today as the faculty director of the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, who organized today's panel and the series. I'm also a climate scientist who works on understanding and predicting the evolving risks to our communities driven by a changing climate. This is why in 2024, I founded the Climate and Wildfire Research Initiative under the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. The goal was to have a home to bring together the research community across disciplines and institutions and tackle the most critical challenges related to fire. Even before the devastating 2025 LA fires, I've been acutely aware of the tremendous challenges and the deep uncertainty we face as climate-driven disasters like fire and flood become increasingly intense and less predictable. Today's panel of experts brings a diverse range of knowledge to help answer questions about what is, and crucially, what isn't known about the role vegetation, the built environment, and other factors play in urban fire spread. I believe we must break out of our silos as scientists and researchers to ensure that community members and policymakers have the best available knowledge when discussing and forming policy. Without further delay, let me introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Nurit Katz, UCLA's Chief Sustainability Officer.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really wonderful to join you all here today. In my role at UCLA, I've been hearing from a wide range of stakeholders with concerns and questions related to Zone Zero and defensible space. Fire survivors, residents, local government officials, nonprofit organizations. Everyone I talk to shares similar concerns about fire safety and fire resilience. However, as many of you have likely read in the news lately, there have been a wide range of views about how best to achieve that, and especially within the rules for Zone Zero, the 5-foot ember-resistant zone around the home. There are concerns about how to ensure that the rules are clear enough for implementation and also flexible enough to address the diversity of geography, urban density, and fire conditions across the state of California. There have also been concerns raised about potential impacts, especially in Southern California and in urban areas, and intersections with other climate hazards like extreme heat. As a sustainability professional, I deal with a lot of issues that involve complex systems, political, social, ecological, from climate change to the biodiversity crisis. As Alex noted, to solve these kinds of challenges requires bridging silos and creating interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration and solutions. UCLA and other universities serve as anchor institutions and play a key role in bringing together community, scientists, and policymakers to solve some of our toughest challenges. In today's webinar, diverse experts from the University of California will share different perspectives on the complexity of the science around vegetation and home survival, what the science says, and areas where more research is needed. These perspectives aim to broaden the conversation and add to the voices that many of you have probably heard in recent public events, which include very important perspectives, such as home safety engineers and fire response professionals. Dr. Longcore will provide a broad overview of where the science is today, and then Dr. Moritz, Dr. Ossola, and Dr. Guzman will share more in-depth on recent research. Future webinars may address more of the policy questions, analysis of the impacts of proposed rules, and a range of other topics related to wildfire resilience. Today, after these presentations, we will address some of the audience questions we've received ahead of time, and you can also put new questions in the Q&A function. And with that, I will hand it to our first presenter, Dr. Longcore.
Thank you, Nurit. So I'd like to start today talking about the drivers of structure loss, which is obviously sort of at the center of the question about Zone Zero and the regulations that are going to be put in place to manage risk around homes. And so what I wanted to start with is just sort of looking at evidence that different disciplines approach this question differently. They've investigate based on their training and tools and orientation. And I think there's kind of three different kinds of evidence that goes into understanding these structural law studies. And the first are small scale demonstrations and experiments. So these demonstrations, sometimes they have replicates, but they're always simplified so that the variables can be controlled, and they look often at extremes and worst case scenarios. So for example, this study about the potential effect of a hedge is actually a hedge that is made of dried branches, not live branches. The second, and so they're kind of like a toxicology test that lets you know that something can happen, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the degree to which it's happening in the real world under real world situations. The second are sort of forensic investigations about cases that are looking at individual structures and drawing conclusions about what caused a fire to spread, and whether or not it damages or doesn't damage the structure. And these are okay for creating hypotheses, but they're not really conclusive for statistical reasons, because ultimately they're case reports about usually a non-random sample. And so they don't allow us to identify the contributions of different attributes. For example, this deck versus the vegetation next to the deck. And then third are things that we characterize as being post-fire analyses that are statistical models that are kind of like an epidemiological study. And in this instance, it's looking at a whole population or a random sample of all the properties affected in a fire, classifying the outcomes, comparing all of the exposure variables, the vegetation, the materials, distance to structures, home hardening, the environment, and then using statistical models that separate the signal from the noise and infer which factors independently elevate or reduce risk. And so these then produce risk models that are useful to extrapolate to other similar events that are in similar conditions. And we can think of these, as I said, like an epidemiological model of figuring out what things are affecting health, what actually matters in the real world after a real fire. And most of the evidence that has been presented to the Board of Forestry on the Zone Zero rule development has really been in the first two categories, and far less discussion and acknowledgement of the results of studies that are in this third category. So what I'd like to do is walk through what we know about or have learned from these post-fire statistical models that are relevant to the question of controlling risk in the first 5 feet around structures. So just to go through these, the citations are above each of the images. In 2014, we have a study from San Diego County that suggests that there's a risk of trees overhanging buildings. And then they attribute that risk of the leaf litter accumulation from the trees. This study also found a benefit of defensible space up to removing about 40% of the vegetation within 100 feet of the structure, but found no benefit of any additional clearance beyond that, either in the percent of vegetation or in distance from the structure. In 2016, we have a similar analysis in San Diego County that finds vegetation is not a strong predictor of structure loss, that it's other factors that influence loss in that particular fire. In 2017, using San Diego County again, there's a combination of home hardening and defensible space only accounts for 14% of the risk of structure loss. Everything else is attributable to other things. In 2019, a statewide study looks at the effect of defensible space on structure survival, finds that it is virtually nil, but identifies the need to look at things that are close to structures, and specifically talks about irrigation and removal of dead plant material to reduce ignitability near structures. Moving on to 2021, looking at the Thomas Fire, it explicitly looked at Zone Zero and found that Zone Zero explained about 9% in the variation of structure loss in the subset that it was looking at, but that was completely associated with the presence of combustible fences and not with the presence of any type of vegetation. In 2023, we had a study of the Woolsey fire that looked at vegetation presence, had excellent data on vegetation within 10 feet of structures, and found it not to be an important variable influencing structure loss, despite, and they say this explicitly in the paper, having looked for that effect. In 2025, we have the Escobedo study that found for several fires near Chaparral, adjacent to Chaparral vegetation, the presence of high moisture content trees was associated with a reduced risk of loss. So here we have vegetation associated with safety as opposed to risk. And finally, a study in 2025 that shows some role for vegetation, but not addressing the moisture content or the difference between trees and shrubs. So this isn't every study done, but it's an overview of what we have for Southern California. We have wide agreement on some things. One, that it's where you build is substantially more important than hardening and defensible space, that the distance between structures is much more important than hardening and defensible space. Obviously, we can't control that after the fact. That connected combustible fences are associated with increased risk of structure loss, and this also goes for mulch. That accumulated dead vegetative material is associated with increased risk, but we need a lot more research on types of vegetation. And finally, that defensible space is indeed important for firefighter access and reducing the probability of ignition within 100 feet from structures. But what we don't find in these studies, even when people have looked, in post-fire statistical models, an independent role that strongly suggests, or even weakly suggests, that eliminating all vegetation within 5 feet of structures is beneficial. And so we know some things that I think are in the Zone Zero plead, the current proposal, that are widely agreed upon: the need to clean out gutters, the need to reduce dead material, the need to get combustible materials like fences, wooden fences, away from structures. But we don't currently have broad scientific agreement that complete removal of vegetation within that zone provides any significant benefit in real world situations. So with that, to set the table, I'd like to move on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Travis. And our next speaker is Dr. Moritz.
Okay. Can you guys hear me and see me? Hello, hello.
You're good.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to the audience for your attendance and interest. I'm going to talk about kind of the linkage of concepts from parcel to community, because I think often the community scale gets left out, yet we're still worried about some of the same issues. What we're looking at here on the upper left is an individual cabin burning in the 2007 Angora fire in Tahoe. Below that is Paradise, a neighborhood in Paradise. In the Camp Fire in 2018, and then to the right of that, in the center of the screen, is Santa Rosa and the Tubbs Fire. And all these have kind of shown us largely the same thing, which is that these homes are burning. The vegetation around them is often left largely intact, not always, but very, very often. And then it's highlighting the importance that structure hardening could play in reducing the initial ignition and spread of these kinds of events. To give away a little bit of the punchlines up front, we need a holistic and comprehensive approach to the many different fire-related risks that communities face, because there are a whole slew of them, lots of different mitigation potential activities to take. There really is very limited research on interactions between home losses and the vegetation immediately around homes. We're kind of extrapolating in many cases. There's large uncertainty about when and where plants are actually combustible. And so I think the recognition very early on here, or a baseline recognition, is that we're making decisions under great uncertainty, and that there are trade-offs involved in making these decisions. That has to be kind of the backdrop. And so my emphasis would be, or my conclusions would be to focus on really what we do understand well about hazardous aspects, in particular, in this case, zone 0, focusing on other combustible materials other than vegetation, and the importance of embers. Okay, so zooming out and looking at this continuum, we have a whole range of scales at which planning and mitigation decisions are made. And we don't currently have, for most communities, any framework to address all of the risks at these different scales. And so one of the things that we've come up with, and we have in the Santa Barbara region, where I've done a fair amount of work, is what's called a Regional Wildfire Mitigation Program, an RWMP, which tries to address a bunch of different risks at a bunch of different scales. Very briefly, focusing kind of at the core and the community, the people, right? Getting them organized, educated, and trained. At the next scale out is the built environment, all the shared infrastructure that we all rely on. So road networks and the evacuation implications, water supplies, power infrastructure, all of that built environment that we need to retrofit and harden and make more resilient. And then the landscape scale, where we're building our communities and what different land covers are out there and how that affects how we would prioritize mitigation across the landscape. And for an example, again, here's the Santa Barbara region, many different community types, some very wealthy, some underserved, many different neighborhoods with different characteristics, different years built, road networks, et cetera, et cetera. And then from the land cover perspective, the landscape domain, we have something that we've learned that's really important and somewhat unique. We have a vegetated green belt kind of protective buffer above the western part and above the eastern part shown here in these rectangles, which is largely an agricultural belt, but there are also many other, especially to the west here, these yellowish colors, these other natural fuel breaks, which are golf courses or irrigated, open spaces or pastures that are, or rather grazing lands that are grazed. And all of the home losses in this region have tended to be above these greenbelt buffers between the national forest and the neighborhoods, or in between, in the middle between them, where we don't have one anymore. We don't have this buffer. So on this slide, we're showing kind of the potential positive role of vegetation, or rather vegetation. And the areas in brighter yellow, these kind of longer worm-like polygons along the ridge lines, those are areas where hazardous vegetation has historically been seen as useful to remove and create fuel breaks. So we have here a recognition that vegetation is playing these multiple roles. In some places, it's considered part of the hazard, and in others, it's actually protective and part of the solution. Zooming down into the parcel scale, we kind of shift that perspective, and we really only consider vegetation as hazardous. And that's a somewhat unique perspective to our part of the world, as I'll show in a second. But it also makes sense if you are defining what defensible space is supposed to do, and if the primary role is to provide access for firefighters to actually do their work and defend a home, it does make sense to think like that. My lab has done quite a bit of flammability testing on plants, and we've come up with some fairly simple relationships. This infographic kind of encapsulates part of that basically drier vegetation is more flammable, right? And more moist vegetation is less flammable. And that's not surprising. That dovetails with most of what Travis just told us. And it also dovetails with our common sense about how plants and why plants burn. Looking outside of California, we start to see some recognition of this gradient in the context of planting aspen near structures to reduce risk. Relatively pure aspen stands are likely to reduce fire behavior, fire occurrence, and fire severity, except in the most severe fire weather conditions. This is out of Utah, but it's also kind of the Canadian perspective on aspen as sort of an asbestos forest type that's very hard to burn in most cases. Another perspective that recognizes this gradient of protective to neutral to hazardous is from Australia, a recent review on areas right around the home. In the tree zone, the primary aim of fuel management is to retain trees to absorb radiant energy and capture embers while reducing surface fuel loads. This is not, it's just saying that there are parts of a property away from the structures where actually it might be a good idea from a radiant heat and an ember screening potential. And then some work that I actually was involved in Australia, negative association between average NDVI, that's greenness, moisture content, and house loss may indicate that the selection of plants with lower flammability affords houses some protection during wildfire. Again, not saying that planting in zone 0 is a good idea and is protective, but just recognizing that this plant dryness, flammability, and this gradient of protectiveness to hazardousness exists and is important and worth recognizing. Some of the recent work we don't have time to go into, although I do have some things to say about it if we get into it in the question and answer period. There are some recent tests that we saw presented in one of the previous Board of Forestry meetings, and then the very recent release of these reports from IBHS. Again, we don't have a ton of time to go into them, but I would summarize by saying they are important contributions to what is really a very sparse body of work. We don't have a lot of research on these specific questions. They do provide support for some of the established factors like home spacing and home hardening, and some of the less well understood ones like combustibles in zone 0. I think they are quite preliminary. They're based largely on descriptive statistics without a whole lot of attention to model building and uncertainty, or interactions between variables, statistical power, et cetera. Hopefully a lot of that will play out as they go through the peer review process and give us more robust, more conclusive findings. I think really something that all of us need to think about is they assume that there's this shift from embers to radiant heat and a neighboring home burning, and what we need to do about that, that's appropriate and should be taken for granted. And I guess many of us involved in this for a while, we've seen it go from a focus on the ember resistant zone 0 area to something that's supposed to protect against neighboring homes burning, which is a very different and much more difficult situation, which either one we still don't have a great deal of information on. So I would say we should concentrate on what's known to be important: home hardening to reduce structure ignition vulnerability. This is sort of for places that are already in existence. If we're starting from scratch, we have a lot more flexibility, but for places that are already there, home hardening, maintenance of dead and dying plant material, and mitigation across all scales. I think we need to think in terms of uncertainty. How do we make decisions under uncertainty? Are we mitigating against the 7.0 earthquake or the 10.0 earthquake? What are we trying to address? And all the trade-offs. I also think that there's an assumption here that residents aren't able to think for themselves, which I think rubs many of us the wrong way. I think a phased implementation based on what we already know makes a lot of sense, and establishment of some independent testing facilities for California so that we can have many studies to learn from and start to get some synthesis and some general principles emerging from that to base policy and regulation on. Thanks, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morris. And next we have Dr. Ossola.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. In this talk, I want to briefly share some observations and some data that we've been collecting in the Eaton Fire and Palisades as well. First of all, vegetation is not a monolith. In the Eaton Fire, there are about 202 species of trees planted. When the Eaton Fire happened, 30% of them, they didn't even have a canopy on because they are deciduous. They didn't have leaves on. So it remains to be seen what's their contribution to that particular aspect of flammability and the production of embers. These are observations that we did in the field for months.
You need to share your slides.
Oops. You can't see it?
Not yet.
Apologies for that. Can you see it now? Sorry for that. Said before, number of species that are planted in Altadena and Pacific Palisades is very high, and vegetation itself is not a monolith. This is just a few examples of species that didn't have canopy on during winter time, so they didn't have fuel to burn in the first place because wood doesn't easily ignite. These are few examples of what we saw on the fires. You can see the vegetation most of the time is actually damaged from the buildings being on fire. You see on the left-hand side a tree where the phenology of the tree was actually delayed from the stress of the house in flame. So it remains to be seen whether the removal of vegetation is actually helpful in this particular situation. We have a lot of other
Travis needs to.
We have a lot of other fuels that we need to better understand. This is an example where vegetation was actually ignited by vehicles on fire. This is on the street. You have a lot of new materials that are going to be potentially dangerous, like cars and electric vehicles that are really hard to extinguish itself. In our case, we spend a significant amount of time on the fires. We actually scan as many places as possible to try to document the 3D structure of this particular landscape before cleanup. You can see here all this data that we collected that we are currently analyzing. It's going to take months to make sense of it overall. As Max addressed, we know that maintenance is key, and we know that weak points in our urban forest can be problematic. You see here the ignition of this particular oaks in weak points. It remains to be seen whether even a complete xeriscaping with pebbles and the removal of any ground cover that can be burned is a real solution to avoid ignition of vegetation. You see here on the right-hand side a tree that was ignited because embers were flying around and that it just cocked in the back. We know that mulch is a no-go, so I guess we all agree that that's something that we need to rethink. So we need to rethink other materials that we're completely neglecting, like artificial grass. In this particular example here, you see that it just burned from the building outwards. We know that proving or disproving ignition in zone zero is very, very difficult. Okay, and this is a typical example of an ignition, and we have no idea what happened there. We don't know whether there was a person that was defending that particular building, whether there were Cal Fire crew or someone else trying to extinguish this. And this is where most of the evidence actually is lacking that human component. What humans are doing when something like this happens, okay? The most tragic thing that I've seen in my 2 months of fieldwork on the fire were actually the garden hoses melted in front of the yards. And we have no idea how to measure the people effect on all of this. It's also difficult to ignite some plants, believe it or not, whether you have succulents and a few other plants here. You see these images. If the building, is properly made, like this wall on the right-hand side, you can clearly see that the building itself, the wall shielded the vegetation from being burned. So it remains to be seen which way we are trying to understand the effects, the reciprocal effects between plants and the built environment. So what is next? Well, we need much more data, and we need much better data to inform policies that are sensible, they are scalable, and they can be enforced if needed, considering the challenges that we have ahead. We are self-funding some research Essentially, we are trying to pyrotype over 565 tree species that are planted in urban California right now. Remember, Altadena and Pacific Palisades, they were started as wild urban interface fires, but they became urban fires, which is a completely different ballgame. This is just an example of some pyrotyping, is a thermal imagery of how we do pyrotyping, measuring different types of flammability traits for all the different species. And in some preliminary data that we've been working with University of Sydney, we can demonstrate that some dry litter of some species are actually pretty difficult to ignite. I'm not saying that they're not going to ignite. Every plant is going to eventually burn. So will buildings that are made of wood. The idea is how we minimize the risk, trying to optimize the selection of species that we are around in our urban areas. A last shout out, I would like to see much more information related to what are the maladaptive impacts of policies. This is Luisa, one of our postdocs. We just recently finished an analysis looking at CAL FIRE data in zone 0 and zone 1, really. We already lost between 2018 and 2022 a lot of urban tree canopy. And it remains to be seen what are the effects of policy into our future goal to create and sustain a sustainable environment in California. Thank you for your attention, and I pass it to Edith.
Dr. de Guzman, you're on.
Thank you. All right. I trust you'll let me know if you cannot see my slides, but I'm sharing them now.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you to SLEGC for hosting. I'm going to briefly share some preliminary findings from ongoing studies from Eaton and Palisades and introduce some impacts beyond fire that should also be considered as major regulatory decisions get made affecting the whole state. As you heard from Alessandro just now, we and several of our colleagues have spent considerable time in the burn scars conducting ground assessments, as well as using various public data sources to identify the predictors of structure loss in both of the burn areas. And I'm going to share two of these studies with you, the first of which was to assess how varying tree characteristics were associated with how trees fared in the fires. And the second of which is aimed at identifying factors associated with structure loss. I do want to note that Alessandro and I are involved in the first of these studies directly, but not the second, and that our colleague Francisco Escobedo with the U.S. Forest Service has given us permission to share the results from the second study. So in the first of the studies, which focused on tree damage, our teams assessed over 2,000 trees in the weeks and months following the fires. We were recording details about where on the tree we observed the fire effects, the extent of the damage, and any observed resprouting, as well as species and tree measurements and the like. This allows us to determine whether there are tree species or types that fare better or worse. And we will repeat all of these measures in the spring to see how trees are doing longer term and also to document tree removals. Preliminary results for the Eaton area show that tree structure matters more than whether a tree is or isn't native. While we have many fire-adapted native species, the reality is that there is incredible diversity in our native species. You can think of the fact that some are deciduous, others are evergreen, some have thin bark, while others are almost impenetrable. And we even have native palms, and palms have justifiably gotten a bad rap because of their flammability. What the data do show, however, is that trees with higher crown, which is where the leafy canopy is, did better. And we will be turning to analyzing data from the Palisades fire next. But for now, an important point here is that the story of how fire damages different trees is complex. The second study, which was led by Carl Norland at the USGS, looked at various factors and how they were associated with structure loss. And it falls into the third category of the study types that Travis talked about, and that it's epidemiological in its approach, so to speak. Here you can see a snapshot of a few factors in the two communities. Both Pacific Palisades and Altadena have portions of their neighborhoods where structures are actually built within Zone 0 proximity of each other. And on average, there are 2 homes within 30 feet of other homes in both of these communities. Both had higher than average tree canopy for the region, and socioeconomics are clearly different, as most of you no doubt know, because either you live here or you've read about these communities. I promise this is the only slide of this type that I'm going to show you. The researchers looked at several factors, as I mentioned, and here you see just 3. If you look at the middle box highlighted in green, you can see that they actually found that the amount of tree cover tells a different story in Eaton, which is the green line, versus Palisades in the orange line. So we cannot simply state that more trees equal either better or worse structure survival outcomes in these particular cases. At the neighborhood and the parcel scales, the researchers found that urban vegetation was less important than urban morphology, or the layout of the built environment, which is unsurprising given that many other studies have come to this conclusion as well. Depending on the scale, home destruction was more affected by factors including the so-called structure basal area, which is a composite measure of development density and size of building footprint, as well as the number of homes in defensible space zones. So I know that was a super quick overview of really complex research. So let me boil it down to just a few key points. With the second study I just mentioned, analyses at the parcel level versus the neighborhood actually told different stories. This is a good reminder that scale really matters, and findings and narratives can change accordingly. The researchers of this study do explain the differences, but that's not always true of research narratives. So in research, it's important to be able to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. If you ever feel like that's not what you're seeing in research, it might be time to change where you're standing, bring in some other voices, and make sure that you're getting the whole picture. The second point is that, and here I'm echoing again some of what you heard from Travis, while denser development is correlated with more building loss, vegetation effects are just much more complex. If anybody tries to convince you that less vegetation means higher fire resilience of the built environment, you can let them know that you attended this webinar and that you know that's not accurate. And finally, tree and vegetation maintenance really matters because it helps influence structure and moisture content and other factors that are important to determining fire outcomes. Native species can do really well, but so can non-natives. I also want to just quickly turn to other impacts that we haven't really talked about, but which we really should consider. I've been working on heat adaptation for the last decade, and I'm not the only one in that space who is very concerned about the impacts that large-scale vegetation removal would have on our urban cooling goals. Loss of shade means higher heat exposure and energy demand, in particular for older homes with poor insulation built before the adoption of modern energy standards. My Luskin Center for Innovation colleagues and I are just starting to explore this question and are working on a proof of concept to quantify this, hopefully for the entirety of LA County, so stay tuned for that. And then the other trade-off is that changes to Zone 0 vegetation, which of course occur largely in hillside zones, will potentially impact soil permeability and stability. This is concerning because steeper terrain is made more stable by the presence of healthy vegetation. Without it, dry periods create hydrophobic soils, which then tend to do a poor job of absorbing precipitation that now often falls increasingly in these flashy, large volume storms. So my hope is that as we continue to engage in the topic of Zone 0 and defensible space, that we also take into consideration the many types of resilience and adaptation needs that our era demands, including but not limited to fire. Thank you for your attention, and I'll now hand it back over to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Dr. de Guzman. And I think we'll be shifting to everyone on camera now for a facilitated question and answer session here. We had quite a lot of questions that we received ahead of time, and then we've had a few that have come in on the Q&A. Folks are welcome to keep adding them. I do want to acknowledge that the topics that we are discussing today are very complex. You can easily spend 8 hours digging into these studies. We will be following up by email with the recording of the webinar, but also other resources that may be helpful to folks as they navigate understanding all of the different science that is out there, as well as the rules themselves. We received a number of questions about Zone Zero rules that really would be best answered by the Board of Forestry, which is the rulemaking body that is currently making the rules. There are a couple that are simple that I'll answer, but for other questions and also comments, we did receive a number of comments about concerns with the rules. I would encourage you to visit bof.fire.ca.gov, which is the Board of Forestry website. And if you go under programs to defensible space, you can find all of the materials from their meetings, as well as the public comments at bof.fire.ca.gov, which is the email to submit your questions and comments to. So we won't be speaking on behalf of the board about details of the rules, but two questions that came in I can answer very quickly. One was about how much vegetation will be allowed in Zone Zero, and the answer is that is still being determined. So the latest draft rule plead from the board outlines 4 different options for vegetation, and that's where a lot of the discussion and dialogue has been. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of the public kind of debate around this issue has unfortunately many times been framed as oppositional. And I think it's really important to remember that all the stakeholders engaged here are very concerned with fire safety and really want to figure out a solution to Zone Zero. The board has very patiently listened over many long meetings to hundreds of people's public comments, and they're struggling with a very complex issue and trying to find something that works here. So for those new to this topic, I would really encourage you to focus on the things that we all share and the places where there are agreement. So the second question that came in from the rules that's simple to answer is about how protected trees will be affected. That's an area where the Board of Forestry has been really responsive to public input, including from local government agencies. And the current proposed rule plead does have an exemption for trees that are protected by local ordinance, such as here in LA County, our native oak trees, for example. But now I'd like to take a question from the Q&A function on Zoom and propose it to the whole panel, which is, given that there are a lot of areas where more research is needed and there is uncertainty and less conclusive results, specifically around vegetation, does the panel have any suggestions on future study design? And we can take, whoever would like to go first. What kind of studies do you think are needed? What kind of research would be helpful? I know the idea of a independent, probably university-connected, California-based testing site was brought up, but what other sorts of studies and ideas do you have?
Well,
Anyone
I'll
want to
start.
take it first? Yeah, thank you,
think-
Dr. Moritz.
I think the different types of studies that Travis had outlined, I think we're going to learn a lot going forward from kind of post-mortem, looking back. It's very difficult because we don't have perfect pre and post-fire data for a lot of those situations. So, but I think we'll continue to learn more from that. I think that fire is such a complex problem that, there's going to be different findings in different kinds of fires with different vegetation types and different construction types. So I think that it's such a complex problem that it's going to take us a while to generalize. And I think we need a lot more studies. I don't think there's any one specific study design that is going to solve that whole problem. I think it's just a field of work that's relatively young, that as it matures, we'll have more conclusive findings to base concrete regulations on. Right now, we don't have those concrete findings, so we're acting we're deciding in a realm of uncertainty, and I think that that's the way we have to proceed, considering all the trade-offs.
Thank you. Others have thoughts on future research and potential study design in particular?
Maybe I can pitch in just a thought. California, we're spanning so many different climate zones and vegetation types, and one single value, one single number in a policy most likely is not going to be effective when we're trying to scale up solutions in such a great state with, millions of buildings in urban areas and wild urban interfaces. So we need something that is scalable somehow.
The other thing I would add, scalable, absolutely. But even deciding what are we trying to mitigate against, even the basic question of, is it an ember attack? Which I think there's fairly widespread agreement that embers, cause most of the home losses and initiate most of the conflagrations that we're worried about, or not, right? That alone, just even deciding on what it is we're actually trying to study and mitigate against, I think needs some clarity.
Thank you. Dr. Add?
Yeah, so I was just going to say that one is sort of sorting out and recognizing that there are certain types of fire that threaten structures, and that things that are wind-driven fires, particularly in Southern California, that we need to talk about, and identifying sort of separately what are the considerations across different fire types, because we're going to and in different parts of the state. And this goes back to the sort of allowing for some nuance in rulemaking. But what the other thing I just want to say is there are things that I think this group and everybody who presents at the Board of Forestry can all agree upon. And that would be, from a policy perspective, the place to start. Because I heard this, mulch. No one here is disputing that dry wood chip mulch next to your home is a risk, or the wooden fences, or accumulation of leaves and needles in gutters and adjacent. And so there is a number of things that are part of the Zone 0 regulation that we certainly have widespread agreement on that could be moved forward without controversy. And so I just want to isolate that really what we're talking about is the role of live vegetation, trees, shrubs, ground cover, etc. And the desire, and I think you probably heard it here, a little bit of frustration that the different ways of investigating this, including some of the ones that are most statistically sophisticated, haven't been fully made part of the conversation by the Board of Forestry and its consultants. So that's I think a conversation that needs to go forward. We need to do more research, but there's also a whole lot that we do agree upon that's uncontroversial, and I think should move forward without delay.
Yeah, and that's a helpful answer for one of the audience questions, which was sort of, what should I do right now, knowing that these rules are still pending? And it sounds like, removing known combustibles like wood mulch, dead vegetation, collected dry leaves, clearing out your gutters, clearing leaves off your roof. If you're ready to get rid of that wood fence, there's a lot of good evidence for that. And then, of course, although this webinar is focused on vegetation, the home hardening pieces for our urban, constituents here, screening your vents, et cetera. There's really good resources out there, on the home hardening side, including, from IBHS and others. So there's a lot that you can do right now to try and help harden your home, because obviously the structure density and where your home was built are not things that you can control. But there is a lot that you can do and a lot of good resources, which we can share. Dr. de Guzman, did you want to say anything about study design or future studies, either that you're involved with or that you think we should be doing?
Well, I think one area that was brought up today is we don't really know what happens with the human impact and what happens when people stay behind. And we are seeing a shift where we would have never imagined first responder agencies saying, actually, it's beginning to make sense to share that responsibility with community members to some extent. So I think studies that could capture that dimension would be really interesting. Right now, we know very little about what happens in that realm, and modeling can't really do very much about that.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat about drought and how do we kind of deal with this while also factoring in the impacts of drought to landscape vegetation in Southern California, including water conservation. And I can kind of start this one and then hand it to our panelists. Although I'm speaking today in a UCLA capacity, I also serve as commissioner for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the largest public utility in the nation. And water conservation is critical for Southern California. That said, as public agencies, we always need to balance different factors. And I think there is good evidence that, well-hydrated vegetation is important. And so there may need to be amendments that focus on zone 0 or the zone closest to the house and really encourage better hydration. That said, native plants do stay better hydrated with less water. And so our existing programs for turf replacement, both through DWP, MWD, and others, are a great resource for homeowners who want to shift towards more fire resilient vegetation that requires less water to stay hydrated. And I know Dr. Ossola and others on the panel may have comments. We got quite a few questions that are sort of about the type of plants. So I know a lot has to do with maintenance and hydration, but if anyone wants to address the type of plants question or how to deal with this during a drought, would welcome your answers.
Well, just acknowledging the LA fires, they happen at winter time, first of all, after 7 months of drought, right? So vegetation was already stressed significantly. So when we have these situations where, climate change or something else interacts with our vegetation, is something to consider. Studies should also look in the future more about the effects of global circulation patterns like El Niño, La Niña cycles, where over the years is drying landscape more or less, depending on rainfall, depending on the number of atmospheric rivers we get, because usually you have a delay effect of vegetation growing, faster during, rainfall period, and then 2 years on, then you have a lot of fuel in the wild-urban interface, but also in gardens. So that's something that we are completely still very shallow in terms of evidence. That's something to look at.
Yeah, thank you. And there's also, to follow up while we're on you, Dr. Ossola, someone was asking about artificial turf, which I think was included in your presentation, if you want to comment further on the dangers of artificial turf and flammability of turf and chemicals, et cetera.
Well, as you can imagine, in someone's backyards, you have hundreds of different types of materials, people hoarding things in the backyard, in front, plastics and a few other flammable materials. It remains to be seen the interactive effect of Zone Zero policies with other policies that currently are, either implemented in California or they will be implemented. For example, in terms of turf, we have policies now sort of asking to stop irrigation of non-functional turf. For example, if these policies scale up across the board in all urban California, then it remains to be seen how very dry vegetation in the lawn, for example, might actually contribute to greater flammability. Every plant will burn. I can assure you that 100%, but if you have a cactus that is 95% water, I bet you that is really hard to ignite that because we tried. So in California, we have 7,000 taxa right now in the market, both exotic and native, and we know nothing about all the different flammability traits of this taxa.
Yeah, I know Theodore Payne Foundation, a local organization, recently hosted a great webinar on fire resilient landscaping, and there are some experts that we've been listening to presentations from, including Greg Rubin, who have been focused on fire resilient native landscaping for a long time. So again, rather than just letting your non-functional turf dry out and leaving it there dried out, replacing with native vegetation could be a fire resilient strategy. There's a number of questions in the chat about sort of the timing. Is there any science or experiments that could be done now that could inform this ongoing rulemaking process, or is the timeline for these larger studies just kind of too long for the current rulemaking process? Anyone have a comment on that?
Just on the timing, I read this morning that the Board of Forestry is going to take this back up again in March. so isn't making the deadline. And I expect there to be more results coming out from the LA County fires along that time or coming into next summer, as well as people develop those and get them into the publication pipeline. They are, of course, studies of those particular conditions and this particular, location, but will add to and, sort of weight of evidence of finding or not finding the importance of different factors in structure survival. So
Thank you.
can't predict exactly, but I'm guessing we will see more along the further we get from those fires, we'll start seeing more studies of them.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions related to home hardening. And, I know we've heard a lot of stakeholders ask, why is there a focus on this when home hardening is important? The Board of Forestry does not have control over home hardening. So there will have to be other processes around building code in other areas. And, as with many of the challenges we try to solve in the public sector, multi-agency approaches and collaboration between agencies are going to be important to ensure that we are kind of addressing this on many different fronts, certainly. As this webinar is mostly about the science rather than a lot of the other questions about the impacts and the costs, et cetera, that are coming in, we did get one question from an attendee who wants to know, what could they study? What kind of PhD programs are there for young scientists who want to get into this space? And I think probably the whole panel could chime in on some options there coming from different UCs and programs.
I suggest they get in touch with Max and the Moritz lab. But LA also needs a lot of assistance. So there's stuff happening up and down the state.
So
Excellent.
One suggestion would be, don't silo yourself in a single discipline. Plant scientists should learn how to better collaborate with, engineers, policy, planners, and all of that. It's a really complicated problem, and if we silo ourselves in a single discipline, we'll fail. So having a program that cherish that interdisciplinarity, and across the UC system, we have a lot of expertise in our 10 campuses. I think we should position us as the world leader on how to get out of this particular situation. And thank you for being willing to be a student.
Absolutely. Again, there are many questions that we aren't going to have time to address today, but some that our experts may have resources about. For example, there was a question from a colleague at a major public agency about recommendations specific to critical facilities. There have been, again, lots of questions about building codes and home hardening, and a lot about the impacts of Zone Zero that I think we won't be able to tackle in this webinar today. But Sustainable LA Grand Challenge will be compiling some different resources in addition to this webinar. And there's a lot of different ways to engage, a lot of different community events happening in this space, some scientific discussion groups to engage in. So I'm very encouraged to see so many people on this webinar today trying to learn more about this complex topic. And I think the comments that were just made about, the interdisciplinary approach are so important here. We have a lot of differing perspectives that are being shared statewide from building engineers and, wind experts and plant scientists and ecologists and fire response professionals, forestry professionals, and they're all really important. And, as educated and informed community members, I encourage you to look at all of the resources out there as you're taking a thoughtful approach to your own home and if you engage in the policymaking process. So with that, I'm afraid that we are at time, but we will be looking through all of the questions you've sent, and we will aim to answer what we can or point to some resources in the follow-up. So I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists who bring so much expertise to this. I'm very encouraged by the conversation today in terms of bringing diverse perspectives forward. We will continue to engage across all of these different disciplines And I'm hopeful that if anyone can solve this challenge and find a path forward for this critical topic of how we try to protect our homes from ember-related ignition, I think the state of California can. So thank you again to all of our UC experts, and I hope everyone has a safe and wonderful weekend. Take care.